All of the videos in my series are intended to be instructional videos, and it just seems to make sense to me to end each of the series with a bit of a summary, because if you miss something from one video, you might catch it at the end in the summary, or if you didn't make a connection between one topic and one video, maybe by summarizing it, I can help make you see that connection. A long time ago, I mentioned that structure, function, location makes a nice little framework for hanging a lot of information on it. And I'd like to return to that idea here and mention some structures, remind you what their functions are. The locations are probably fairly obvious. So let's look at the heart, the structure of the heart. There are the four chambers, the two atria, two ventricles. There's the septum that runs up between the ventricles that separates oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. There's the valves in the heart. There's four valves in the heart. Remember the AV valves and the semilunar valves. The aorta comes out the top. The pulmonary artery comes out the top. All those structures. So to be able to identify the pathway of blood through the heart and the blood vessels that are attached to the heart is a pretty important topic. So that's structure. We know its function is to pump blood around the heart, and we know its location. But at the same time, we also extended that topic and dealt with the fetal heart. And recognizing that the fetal heart is not exactly the same as the adult heart, because before a person is born, they're not breathing, so the lungs are non-functional, though they still have to develop. They still get a trickle of blood through them, so the tissue is alive, but it's too dense to let the blood flow through. So in the fetal heart, remember, there's a couple of extra features to it that allow the blood to bypass the lungs. In terms of other structures, we know there's lots of blood vessels, but they're grouped into three categories: the arteries, capillaries, and veins. And to recognize the structures of those types of blood vessels and how those structures are specialized to allow them to function properly. Even if you mention the elasticity of the nature of the artery wall, so it can expand and accept a volume of blood and then contract again to get back to its normal size. We can't go past this topic without mentioning the valves and the veins and the capillaries, the fact that the capillaries are only one cell wall thick. The walls of them are only one cell thick, so in terms of structures and the functions for that, of course, it allows the materials to pass into tissues and materials to pass from tissues back into the capillaries quite easily. They're located in every part of the body. Blood, we took blood apart. If you remember, there were four parts to the blood: the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. And each of those, and the plasma, each of those parts has its own function. So the red blood cells have a transport function. They transport oxygen around the body and carbon dioxide in the venous blood. The white blood cells are in charge of the immune responses, so that's the combat infection type function. The platelets are in charge of blood clotting, and the plasma, there's a lot of things dissolved in the plasma, but if you remember, the plasma is like 91 or 92% water, and that much water traveling around in the plasma helps us regulate our body temperature, because you recognize that water doesn't change temperature as fast as some other objects will, and that helps us maintain a constant body temperature. It's also important when we're looking at structures to realize there are some specific features which are in the circulatory system. They're unique features that show up nowhere else in the body. So, for example, the chordae tendineae in the heart, those are the tendons that prevent the big valves from inverting, getting the blood to go from a ventricle back into the atrium. There's things like the nodal tissue. That's a unique tissue in the right atrium of the heart. The sphincter muscles at the arterial end of the capillary end of the arteriole. Sorry, I said that wrong. So there's some specific features. So as you go through all the information about the structures in the heart, in the vessels, the blood. If you come across specific features, make a note of them. They only show up once. Another one that gets relating to the fetal system is the umbilical cord. Structure, function, location, a nice way to hang information on. Nice little stories. In this system, as in a whole lot of other systems, there are some nice little stories. And if you're watching this video for the purposes of trying to understand bits and pieces of it, this is a great way to do it, because in a test situation you will be asked for nice little stories. So you'll be asked to describe the cardiac cycle. It's a standalone topic where the atria contract and they stimulate the ventricles to contract. So you've got the AV node and the Purkinje fibers and the ventricles contracting all at the same time. And you could even put the ECG with that topic, so you get the graph like that. So the cardiac cycle is one of those nice little stories. This is also one, the changes to the heart, the fetal heart at birth. So those two features in the heart which allow the blood to bypass the lungs, they don't last past birth. They grow closed in a matter of a few days. So that's a nice little standalone story. Like, how does that happen? Immunity, there's two parts to that. There's cell-mediated immunity and there's antibody-mediated immunity. So those are both two nice little stories dealing with white blood cells. Again, it's a specific function of white blood cells. Even you think of the lines of defense for the body. What are the lines of defense? Again, a nice little topic that would be easy to examine and answer on a test. Inflammatory response is another one of those where damage to basophils, remember, causes the release of histamines, and that causes tissue swelling, and the lymphatic system gets involved to drain the fluids away. Another one is, again, the capillary tissue fluid exchange, the function of the capillaries, how there's enough blood pressure on the arterial end of the capillaries to force fluids out of the capillary, and that fluid leaving creates a hypertonic situation which draws, by osmotic pressure, draws fluid back in on the venule side, and with that fluid is the waste material that gets taken back to the heart and readied for excretion. So, big topic, lots of little stories, lots of information, and things like, this is a huge topic, and what can go wrong with it? Well, there's a ton of things that can go wrong with the circulatory system, in terms of heart attacks even. The coronary arteries feed the heart. The coronary arteries are those blood vessels on the surface of the heart. And if they happen to get blocked, then the blood can't get through. If the heart tissue is starved of blood, starved of oxygen, a part of the heart tissue can die. That's a heart attack. There's all sorts of things like defects in hearts too, just dealing still with the heart. Defects like a hole in the septum. That's a cardiac defect. It's a birth defect, and sometimes those are very minor. Sometimes the doctors have to go in and sew that hole closed because it causes a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Still staying with the heart, things that can go wrong. The valves may be non-functional. The valves might leak. So you have a leaky valve. Imagine the effect of the AV valve from the left ventricle. It leaks back during the ventricle contraction. Blood leaks through the mitral valve into the left atrium. Well, then the left atrium's partially full, and it drains away, and the ventricle has to pump harder, or the lungs don't get enough blood, or whatever. Things can go wrong. Lots of things can go wrong in the heart. Tachycardia, a racing heartbeat. I mean, the SA node is supposed to be regulating the rate at which the heart beats, and it sends out its little messages. Well, what happens when the it's like a shock wave going through the heart. The heart's racing for no apparent reason. That can cause a heart attack. There's things like the blood clots. They start moving. A pulmonary embolism is an example of one where a blood clot can be moving through the blood, get back into the heart, into the right atrium, right ventricle, get pumped out the pulmonary. Where's it going to go? Into a capillary bed in the lung. Well, pulmonary embolism is when it's actually blocking part of the lung. And if the lung can't get the blood, the lung tissue can die. That can lead to a heart attack, because if the blood can't get out of or into the lung tissue, then the heart's continuing to beat. The heart's going to be beating so hard, and the system is plugged up, the heart can fail. It'll be a heart attack. There can be plaques in arteries as well. Just take a second to think about this one. Lipoproteins. These are lipids that are attached to proteins. That's the way they get around our system. I mean, our liver makes cholesterol, and the cholesterol is supposed to be made, it's supposed to be traveling in our bloodstream, because every cell membrane needs cholesterol. But cholesterol is a lipid. It's attached to a protein, and it travels through the blood. Well, there are times when we have to consider things like high-density lipoproteins versus low-density lipoproteins. High-density lipoproteins are what they call the good cholesterol, the good lipoproteins. These are bad ones. These ones have got a greater percentage of proteins in them. So they're a little, like a micelle, a little speck, if you like, that's made out of lipids and proteins, but the high-density ones have got more protein in them. And as such, they move better. They're not as immiscible in the plasma. The low-density lipoproteins, they don't travel very well, and what can happen here is they can collect along the side of a blood vessel, so they can form hardening deposits called plaques. And if these plaques harden, in an artery in particular, then the artery can't expand like it's supposed to. So you have atherosclerosis, hardening of the artery. Well, the effect of that on the heart, if the heart's beating and it can't get the blood to get into the artery properly because the artery can't expand to accept it, that puts extra stress on the heart. And again, you could have a heart attack. The system could fail. High blood pressure. This is a cause of high blood pressure. Another possible problem that a person could encounter, if this is an artery, what if there's a weak spot in the wall of the artery? And as the blood pumps through it, the weak spot sort of bulges. So the blood continues to pump, and even though it's pumped past that, or the pulse is past that, there's still a weak spot. This is an aneurysm, a weak spot in an artery, and it just means that there's extra blood in that area, and aneurysms can build up and build up. An aneurysm can actually break. And if that breaks, then you've got blood leaking into the system, arterial blood, which is continuously being pumped, and that can be that can cause death. Swollen lymph nodes. In the immune system, we know that the lymph nodes collect up T cells, memory T cells. Well, they can be battling some infection inside the lymph nodes, and lymph nodes are all over the body, and they can get swollen and can be painful. They can go cancerous if it happens to be a cancer cell, and that's lymphoma, cancer of the lymph nodes. Oh, there's so many things. Anemia. We know that red blood cells are supposed to be carrying hemoglobin. Well, what happens if a person's iron level is low? Hemoglobin contains iron. Well, if you don't have enough iron in your system, then your red blood cells aren't going to be transporting enough hemoglobin, so you can't get enough oxygen around your system, and then you're weak, pale, tired, that sort of thing. And then we even mentioned hemophilia, a genetic disorder of the blood. So, just in summary again, please try to remember structure, function, location in every system, and I will return to this topic probably in every system. Nice little stories. Remember the nice little stories and what can go wrong in the systems. Thanks very much, and if you want to keep informed of when I post new videos, don't forget to subscribe.